And in a sunless realm, the sun rose at last. The Emperor raised his sword in a two-handed grip. As his knuckles tightened, the geography of the circuitry ignited along the blade's length, spitting electrical fire and wreathing the sword's length in flame. He didn't speak. He didn't look at any of his warriors. The sword came down. The webway caught fire. Shapes raged in the flames, shadows and suggestions doing battle with the demons, their fiery forms indistinct and ever-changing. The fire-born avatars of fallen 10,000, knee-deep in psychic fire and thrusting with lances of flame. The silhouettes of space marines, the betrayed dead of Istvan, bearing axes and blades and claws. Half-seen sigils of slaughtered legions obscured by the ash of their blackened armor. A giant among giants, its great hands bared and ready as it seared forwards at the crest of the tidal fire. The 10th son of a dying empire, so briefly reborn in his father's immolating wrath. The demons burned in their thousands. To stand before him was to die. There are many crazy theories that rattle around the Warhammer 40k community, but I have to be honest, one of my favourites is that we may see Ferrus Manus one day in the future at the head of the Legion of the Damned. The Legion of the Damned are one of those very old parts of Warhammer 40k lore that never really got properly explored and explained, so there's a lot of mystery around what they actually are. Are they the Firehawks chapter lost in the warp and then now delivering the vengeance of the Emperor, or might they be the betrayed dead of Istvan and the betrayed of thousands of other space marines and warriors over the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy? There's so many options. This stream has sort of been prompted by a rumor that came about this week. You might have seen this on Reddit or on another YouTube channel, etc. But if you're not familiar, this image is from an alleged datasheet, which is basically the cards that accompany Warhammer 40k miniatures. And as you can see, Ferrus Manus is on this datasheet, as are the Legion of the Damned. Now, this is most likely a fake. I'll be honest with you, because I don't know why, but very often people within the Warhammer community like to create fake images or rumors to, I don't know, actually, to trick people and tell their friends that they created something that people believed. But yeah, presumably somebody whipped this up on Photoshop or on Microsoft Paint, decided to spread it around the internet, hoping to trick a lot of people as to the inevitable return of Ferrus Manus. But even if that rumor is not true, even if Ferrus Manus isn't going to return at the head of the Legion of the Damned, I thought it would be a fun opportunity to talk about whether this is possible, whether Ferrus Manus can return to Warhammer 40k, whether he can return at the helm of the Legion of the Damned, and what the lore actually says, what the author actually says, but more importantly, what I think. So we're going to jump straight in. At the start of this stream, you would have heard me reading a passage from Master of Mankind, and that is essentially the genesis of this rumor, because if you're not familiar, in that story, the Emperor of Mankind temporarily leaves the Golden Throne, enters the webway where the Custodians, the Mechanicus, some knights, everybody's been fighting secretly to prevent demons from breaking through the breach and making their way into the throne room, into Terra. This was a problem that was caused by Magnus the Red maybe doing something a little bit wrong. However, halfway through the heresy, the Emperor is able to leave the Golden Throne, go into the webway, seal the warp rift, and in this process, he actually kills a lot of demons, and that's where we get that pretty epic scene. It's also the scene where he actually turns Draknien, the big powerful demon, into the sword, which will later become the sword of Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos. Now, in this story, the Emperor of Mankind does seemingly summon the souls of many of the dead, the betrayed at Istvan, and in particular, Aaron Dembski-Bowden writes, the avatar of Ferrus Manus was indeed summoned. And many, of course, over the years have read this and presumed this means Ferrus Manus will return one day at the head of the Legion of the Damned. This is the moment they were created, and we're just waiting for his inevitable reveal. There are some problems with this. Firstly, the Legion of the Damned didn't appear until M41. They didn't appear until shortly after the Firehawks chapter was lost within the warp, and this has led to the greatest theory within Warhammer 40k as to the origins of the Legion of the Damned, which is that they were the remaining Firehawks legionnaires that survived being lost within the warp, and now they return to deliver the Emperor's fury. In addition to this timeline problem, we also have the comments from the author himself, and we, of course, can't skip over these ideas. So these were actually posted on Reddit. Back in the day, the Warhammer 40k authors were allowed to post on Reddit and engage with fans. They don't really do this anymore because Games Workshop doesn't want them essentially doing this, essentially saying things that might pigeonhole the lore in the future or letting things slip as to what's coming up in future novels. But back in the day, they were allowed to engage with fans quite freely, and many tidbits from the lore were revealed in this way. And so when people asked him about this and did he actually create the Legion of the Damned, he said specifically that it wasn't his intention, as you can see, and that he doesn't think it reads like they are the Legion of the Damned, but he likes the idea and thinks it can be argued it's their genesis or a proto-version. It was unintended, but a nice accidental nod, and it's a fan idea that he's actually okay with, and so he wouldn't mind in the future if this did indeed become the canon. He does also highlight that there are some potential problems with this being the Legion of the Damned, but I think what this is here, and feel free to disagree with me in the chat, but I think Aaron Dembski-Bowden is slightly overplaying his hand in this response, because if you have a look here, he specifically says that the loreheads who read the book, as in the people who proofread Master of Mankind before it came out, they read this book and none of them made the connection that people might think this was the Legion of the Damned. However, guys, let's be honest for a second here, right? If I wrote some fanfiction for you all and I read it next week on a live stream, and in that fanfiction, I wrote about a Space Marine chapter who wore purple and were obsessed with perfection in the name of the Emperor, you would all listen to that fanfiction and you would all comment, oh, this is very obviously an Emperor's Children successor chapter. If we go back to that quote in Master of Mankind, he specifically talks about Space Marines wreathed in flames, goes into detail about how the black ash covers the armor sigils, and so you couldn't tell what legion they were from. I don't believe fundamentally that a Warhammer 40k lorehead, someone whose job it is to proofread Warhammer 40k novels, I don't believe that any of these people would miss this as an obvious implication to the Legion of the Damned. The Legion of the Damned are one of the most famous parts of Warhammer 40k lore. You almost certainly know about them if you've been in the community for a while. So I can't help but think that this is ADB winking at the camera. I think he's having a laugh when he says this because I just don't buy it. It was saying that he didn't notice that fiery Space Marines, fiery black armored Space Marines, could potentially be Legion of the Damned. But then he's also saying that the people that proofread the book also missed this. I'm sorry, but I think ADB's been a little bit cheeky here, just being honest. So not only do we have to explore this because ADB has sort of given the theory, the potential theory, his blessing, as it were, but in addition to that, I'm not entirely sure this isn't what he intended. And whether you agree with me there, I guess we'll see. But I don't think that makes sense. Anyway, let's go through the lore as to what actually happened to Ferrus Manus and his death, because in addition to Ferrus Manus dying, we do get some interesting lore around what it's like when he's dead. So the first thing to note about being dead in Warhammer 40k is that being dead sucks. It's really horrible in Warhammer 40k because if you die, you are basically devoured by demons, and we find this out from Ferrus Manus himself. In The End and the Death Volume 2, as Sanguinius is making his way towards Horus Lupercal to face down his brother, he actually runs in to a being that claims to be Ferrus Manus, or at least his ghost, and it was summoned apparently by Horus in order to torture Sanguinius, to break him, as it were. Ferrus Manus' soul is able to speak to his brother and give him some lessons for the future, and he wishes that his brother Sanguinius is going to be able to kill the War Master and also regain his skull, because at this point in time the War Master has got Ferrus Manus' skull and, well, he'd like it back. So Ferrus Manus gives all of these lessons to Sanguinius and talks to him about how just brutal it is being dead within the setting. The warp devours our souls, those lost and those discarded alike. Magnus, the Pale King, Alfarius, the Red Angel, it spares no one. Death is not release, brother. It is unending torment. Lesson 2, remember. So Ferrus Manus talks about how if you die, the demons will devour your souls for all time. In addition to that, what he's referring to there is that there are also the parts of the demon Primarch souls that now exist in the warp, because, and it's a magical process, so we don't have a lot on the details here, but it appears to be the case that when you ascend to demonhood, your soul is absorbed by the Chaos God. You become a part of the Chaos God, but some of your soul will be cut off. And so those discarded parts of their souls are left in the warp and, of course, devoured by demons for all time. So it's not entirely clear, if we look at this passage, whether Ferrus Manus' soul will be around in Warhammer 40k. Because, of course, this is 10,000 years of the demons tearing apart his soul. Maybe they've eaten all that's left of it. Maybe there's going to be nothing left of Ferrus Manus' soul by the time we get to 40k. However, if we get into the core Warhammer 40k lore and the cult, the Imperial cult that worships the Emperor of Mankind, there's a pretty obvious solution here, which is that the Emperor, in his divine might, is allegedly able to protect souls within the warp. Worshipping the Emperor is not just something you're encouraged to do in the setting, it's pragmatic. If you don't want your soul to be devoured by demons, he's your best ticket to survive 10,000 years of, or, well, an eternity of torment within the warp. So it is totally possible that Ferrus Manus' soul is still around 10,000 years later, and in addition to that, I do think it's worth pointing out what happened to Sanguinius' soul. Sanguinius, in the Horus Heresy, is specifically said to have suffered a fate worse than death, something worse than what Ferrus Manus goes to, and we find this out when people go to his body, in particular Litu. When he finds Sanguinius' body, he notes, Dan Abnett takes this time to explain that there's clearly something happened to Sanguinius that is not just death. Something happened to his soul, apparently. Like, it really not go into detail, but that's very much the implication, and that makes sense, because whereas Ferrus Manus had his head cut off by the Primarch Fulgrim, Sanguinius was killed by what I'm going to call God Horus. Horus with all the powers of chaos flowing through him. Essentially nothing has ever been as powerful as Horus in Warhammer 40k. He's probably the most powerful being we've seen in the flesh, as it were. So I think this is important because, of course, if Ferrus Manus is going to return in some way, potentially at the head of the Legion of the Damned, we don't want to necessarily open the door for any Primarch that dies returning at the head of the Legion of the Damned, or in the Legion of the Damned, or as avatar for the Emperor, because that sort of weakens the setting overall. But this is a specific Ferrus Manus coded solution for allowing him to return in some way. It's also important to remember that Ferrus Manus' return is actually not like brand new kind of lore that's come out of nowhere, and I would probably go as far to say that of all the Warhammer 40k rumours, this isn't something you can lay at the feet of Reddit. If you read the Iron Hands books, they are littered with talk about the potential return of Ferrus Manus. Many within the Iron Hands believe he's going to return. There's a clan that's dedicated to waiting for his return. It is said that after the Horus Heresy ended, Ferrus Manus did return as a ghostly form to some of the Iron Hands and told them he would return during the end times. Ferrus Manus's potential return has long been something within Warhammer 40k lore, and so it seems like it will definitely happen at some point. It doesn't necessarily mean it will be in the near future, but perhaps in the end times, perhaps at some point in the future. And this is a pretty nice way to do it, because should Ferrus Manus return at the head of the Legion of the Damned, by no means is this kind of setting breaking. You know, it really wouldn't be a problem for Warhammer 40k should Ferrus Manus occasionally pop up in a story, beat the crap out of Fulgrim, and then leave. I think that would be fine. It wouldn't be as problematic as if Sanguinius returned or if Horus Lupercal returned, for example. But there is some interesting talk we can have around Primarchs returning generally, because, again, it's not something that is without merit in the lore. So, for example, if we have a look at Conrad Kurtz's Primarch novel, we can see that when he talks to this effigy of the Emperor that he creates, and this effigy talks back to him, suggesting that this effigy does really have at least part of the Emperor's soul in it, it does seem to be the case that the Emperor says that none of the Primarchs are beyond redemption. He doesn't even make Horus an exemption when he says this. He's basically implying here that all of them could come back, in my opinion. Now, this is up to you to decide whether you think this was really the Emperor talking to Conrad Kurz. Conrad Kurz is very insane. You absolutely have the right to make that distinction. But I like to believe this is true, and definitely something that, I mean, if you're going to have fun with Warhammer 40k, it no doubt seems to be the case that the Emperor implies to his son that all of the Primarchs could come back at some point, including, of course, Ferrus Manus. In addition to that, we do have, in a short story called The Board is Set, which is from the Heralds of the Siege anthology, if I remember correctly, we have Malcador and the Emperor playing a game, having a conversation, and they play this game where they essentially have all the Primarchs on the board, except for the 2nd and 11th, and they play out the Horus Heresy. As you can see here, Perfection is the name of Fulgrim, and the Iron General is the name of Ferrus Manus. So the Emperor and Malcador did kind of play out the Horus Heresy, and when they play it out, the Iron General piece breaks, just like happens in the actual lore. And when that happens, the Emperor, who is Revelation, he's often referred to as Revelation, or he appears in the books as this character Revelation, he picks up the two pieces of Ferrus Manus and says, perhaps I will fix that later when I have some time. The obvious implication there being that Ferrus Manus' death might not actually be his permanent death. And again, this is something that doesn't have no merit in Warhammer 40k lore. If we have a look at the genesis of the Emperor, or the alleged genesis of the Emperor, it is said that long ago it was possible for souls to go into the warp and come back out again into new bodies. So perhaps the Emperor thinks he may be able to do that once again, because a Primarch soul is special. And so I think what he's talking about here is the potential for him to create a new body for Ferrus Manus, and in that way he can return to life. You might wonder why the 2nd and 11th didn't get new bodies if they died. Well, firstly, we don't know if they did actually die, or maybe they were just arrested or put in comas, or whether they were just lost. But in addition, the Emperor being in a rush is a considerable point in the Great Crusade, and the exact amount of time it would take for the Emperor to create a new body for Ferrus Manus, and in addition to that, find a way to bring his soul back from the warp, that could take the Emperor years, if at all. Even he is not sure in this passage whether this is something he can actually do. There was just one other quote that I wanted to go through because I think it's really relevant, and a lot of people have been wondering, where are the Legion of the Damned in modern Warhammer 40k? Because they haven't appeared properly in the lore really since the fall of Cadia, and some people even think Games Workshop has forgotten about them or left them out of the canon, but I can assure you this is not true. In the Dawn of Fire series, they are mentioned a few times, and actually the Legion of the Damned are apparently appearing more than ever. So as the Great Rift opened, the Emperor of Mankind has become basically not necessarily more powerful, but he's been able to interact with the galaxy far more than he could previously, and the Legion of the Damned, being one of the ways the Emperor does interact with our galaxy, are therefore far more apparent and appearing much more often. So this is a really great thing, and in addition to that, it works really well with the idea that the Emperor of Mankind might now be able to bring Ferrus Manus in at the helm, because given that they are an expression of his power, the Emperor has been growing in power over 10,000 years. So it took 10,000 years pretty much for the Emperor to become powerful enough to summon the Legion of the Damned at all, apparently. But that does make sense because he has grown in power as the Chaos Gods grow. So as more and more people worship the Emperor of Mankind, he grows in power, and therefore he is able to do more and more crazy things, including summon the Legion of the Damned. And now that he's grown in power even more and the Great Rift has opened, it's not implausible that that could lead, at least in my mind, to Ferrus Manus returning to Warhammer 40k at the helm of the Legion. In the history of the Warhammer 40k and the community, you'll often have heard the phrase, Warhammer 40k is a setting and not a story. However, that's really not true anymore, because in Warhammer 40k today, so many things have happened that were story elements that we thought would never happen because it was a setting. So things like the Primarchs returning, things like getting Leagues of Votann, these were things people thought would never happen in the setting. And that's cool for us now, because when it comes to things like a Legion of the Damned Ferrus Manus, can we really say that will never happen? Because people will have said that to Guilliman returning or the Lion returning. So it's quite cool to be a 40k fan at this point in time, because nothing is really off limits. The interesting thing about this potential lore development, as it were, is that weirdly it has the least lore impact out of all of the Primarchs returning. If you were to bring Sanguinius or Horus back, the ramifications of that are massive. It would be huge for the setting. It would upturn everything. But if you just say Ferrus Manus is back, occasionally he leads some of the Legion of the Damned when they fight for the Emperor against Chaos Incursions or whatever it's going to be, then that actually doesn't really have massive implications. You can have a cool story where Guilliman runs into Ferrus Manus, and maybe Ferrus Manus delivers Guilliman a message. That will be a narrative tool. In addition to that, you can have the Iron Hands, of course, basically reinvigorated with a new a fire within them, because of course their Primarch is now fighting within them once more, which also means that to them that's confirmed these are the end times. And that would probably be some great development for the faction, because if you're not familiar, even as a Dark Angels fan, I feel like I get to say this, the Iron Hands are some dour chaps, and they are incredibly grumpy and basically don't act as their Primarch wanted them to behave. That he wasn't a big fan of them cutting off parts of their own bodies. He wasn't a big fan of them kind of wallowing within their pity, as it were, and was a very pragmatic leader. Okay, so how does the Sapphire King fit into this? Cool question. I'll do a stream on him entirely at some point, putting together his lore. If I'm correct, he is the demon born from Ferrus's frustration from being dead. Yes, if you're not familiar, the Sapphire King is the name of a demon that we do encounter in the Iron Hand supplements, in the Voice of Mars book. That is a demon manifested from the frustrations of Ferrus Manus when he dies. So just like how we see in the end of the Horus Heresy, when Lokun is killed by Erebus, that act created Samus. The Sapphire King was created from Ferrus Manus' frustrations. So yeah, he is still about, and the Iron Hands have defeated him before, but yeah, I don't think this would undo that lore. I don't think it would be a problem for it at all, because ultimately Ferrus Manus is still dead, as it were. If this is what the Legion of the Damned is, they are the dead souls wielded by the Emperor that he kind of protects. The Ferrus Manus is still dead. He's still not going to come properly back to life. He's just going to return at the helm of the Legion of the Damned, and that's not exactly the same as being resurrected, is it? Like, there's a fundamental difference there. He's not going to be able to lead his sons. He's not going to be able to challenge Rabute Guilliman to be Lord Commander of the Imperium. But at the same time, it's a nice middle ground for the setting. So yeah, I don't see a problem with this Sapphire King, but To be fair, that might be a really cool way to introduce Legion of the Damned Ferrus Manus, because one of the things about the Emperor's power, and in particular in that first passage that I played for you guys, in Master of Mankind, we get some fantastic scenes of the Emperor just perma-killing demons. And the Emperor is so powerful, he is able to do this. Even Guilliman is able to do this in 40k with the Emperor's sword. So should Ferrus Manus return as an avatar of the Emperor's power in Warhammer 40k, maybe he will be able to perma-kill demons, and that would be really cool, because then you could have some very funny moments. Of course, Ferrus Manus is going to be wanting a rematch against Fulgrim, and seeing Fulgrim kind of run away because he's terrified of Fulgrim kind of perma-killing him would be pretty funny, I'm not going to lie. Aside from Vulcan, Ferrus is the only other one that actually has a shot of fixing the Golden Throne. That could be another angle for his resurrection. That's true. He would definitely have that capabilities. He wouldn't even need his tools. He'd just sort of wrench his hands in and fix it manually. But yeah, whether he would be able to do that sort of thing, I don't know. I mean, I do really like the idea of Ferrus Manus returning as the head of Legion of the Damned, because that would be a way for the Emperor to give very direct and clear messages to the setting. Because the Emperor can communicate with people. He communicates through the dreams of the custodians. He communicates through the tarot cards. But, of course, these things can be misinterpreted. However, if he had Ferrus Manus, maybe it would take a particularly high amount of power or will. But he could basically allow Ferrus Manus to say, tell Guilliman the throne, or something like that. And then that would allow Guilliman to sort of, know things are going wrong. Perhaps Ferrus Manus is now 90% Necron now. You know what? You do raise a really interesting point about Ferrus Manus sort of being, about him having kind of necrodermis hands. And this is very much confirmed in Warhammer 40k lore. It's also one of the weird things about Sanguinius' arc, because Sanguinius seems to know what necrodermis is, which is not something he should really know, and I suspect was just a mistake by the writers, but I guess we'll see. However, it does make you wonder about Ferrus Manus' return, because of course the Necrons are very famous for being the undead, being the living silver tide that resurrects itself very quickly. So maybe it could be you could have some really cool thing here which would allow Ferrus Manus' soul to interact with Necron tech in some way, because of course he has been working with Necron tech, living metal, necrodermis, for his entire life. So he's already kind of got that experience. There's so many like cool little things that you could do with this storyline that I think would be really fun, and having him occasionally sort of take over the body of a Necron overlord and aid the Imperials would be like badass. Can you imagine that in the story? Who decides where the Legion of the Damned shows up? Is it part of the biggie that's on the throne, or is it the Star Child, or do his shards hold a committee? Great question. So I think it's almost certainly the Star Child, and the writers, to be fair, were quite direct about that in the Dawn of Fire series, where when they talk about the Legion of the Damned, they're talking about it in connection to the Star Child, and that makes the most sense. So my personal theory, and I have a video hopefully coming out about this, probably about next month or so, where my personal theory is that the Emperor on the throne is not actually any more powerful than we see him in the Heresy. That's nothing to be sniffed at, but I think he's still about the same power level. However, the Emperor's like new power, as it were, and as Malkador very much implies, that's from the Star Child part of him, which has grown in the warp as the Chaos Gods grow and as more and more people have come to worship him. So all of this awesome stuff that's happening is coming from the Star Child part of his soul. And so, yeah, the actual part of him that's on the throne is just being tortured, just brutal existence, which I think works very well for the setting. Ferrus's relationship with Fulgrim was important. Fabius cloned Fulgrim. Ferrus's hands are alive. Fulgrim should find them and slap them. Yeah, there is a story back in the day where the Iron Hands do go to a ridiculous length to recover one of his hands, but I think they have got them now, actually. But that's it. There was an old story about Vulcan finding some of the Iron Hands who created a new body for Ferrus Manus's hands, and Vulcan destroys the body because obviously to him it's an abomination that someone would make a robot copy of his brother, basically. So there we have it. The rumours on Ferrus Manus returning at the head of the Legion of the Damned ever spin. One of the most popular theories in Warhammer 40k lore. But let me know what you think. Do you think there's any possibility this could happen? It's not the only way he could return, as we've seen. Perhaps the Emperor could return and build a new body for him. It's not seemingly beyond his power. But I really like this theory. The reason I like it is because it doesn't change the entire setting. It doesn't even massively change the Iron Hands, because the Legion of the Damned are a faction that isn't a POV faction. You sort of just leave them out there in the void, as it were, and they can come in and help the Imperium here, there, and everywhere. They provide a narrative tool for the Emperor to communicate with Guilliman or the Lion, and the Primarch himself, Ferrus Manus, has basically returned in name only. If you do this, he's not going to be the new leader of the Iron Hands, but the Iron Hands might get a new lease of life, and they might be massively encouraged by the fact that their Primarch could be potentially fighting with them once more in the near future. So I really like this theory. I hope it comes true at some point, but unfortunately, I do think a lot of people do just make things up and put them on Reddit because... Actually, I don't know why. I don't know why people do these things, but presumably it gives them a laugh. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the description. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye.